One of the things about the Celts that has intrigued a lot of people, starting with the classical writers and has continued all down to the present day, is Celtic religion.
Imagine standing on the ruins of an ancient hill fort and realizing that just a single human skull might rewrite an entire chapter of Roman conquest. When archaeologists at Loma came across a 2,000-year-old severed skull of a Celtic warrior, they didn't just stumble onto history. They uncovered a message left on display 2,000 years ago, meant to be seen, feared, and remembered. And only now, with modern DNA analysis, does that message finally speak. But what exactly does it tell us about Celtic warriors and the Roman punishments for them? Stay tuned, because we're unraveling this ancient story, layer by layer, in this exclusive video. A severed head that sparked a debate. The world of archaeology was left stunned when researchers found a skull perched in the debris of a collapsed fort wall, with its bone unnaturally pale, as if the wind and sun had spent months stripping it clean. Even before lab reports or DNA sequencing entered the picture, that single detail hinted at something intentional. Someone had wanted this head to be visible. Someone had placed it where no one approaching the hill fort could miss it. And 2 millennia later, the question still remains. Who was this man, and why was his head displayed? Archaeologists working at the Celtic hill fort of Loma expected rubble, pottery, maybe the scattered remnants of daily life. What they didn't expect was a skull lodged within the demolition layer, the same layer created when victorious Roman soldiers from 25 BC tore the fortifications down after the final assault. Around it lay broken arrowheads, splintered weapons, and soot-darkened soil, all the signatures of Rome's methodical violence. But there was no burial pit or accompanying bones, nor any ceremonial placement. Just a head that had clearly been above ground long enough to bleach under the open sky. And yet, the meaning of what they'd found wasn't immediately obvious. A skull in rubble could belong to a casualty dragged down in the chaos of the fort's final hours. It could belong to anyone, a defender, a civilian, even a Roman. But the deeper the researchers looked, the more the picture shifted, and the more disturbing it became. The skull didn't fall with the walls by accident. It had been on the walls. What DNA later revealed would connect this lone head to the very people Rome sought to break during the Cantabrian Wars. But at that point, all anyone had was a fragmentary cranium, sun-bleached bone, and the unsettling sense that the Romans had left it there deliberately as a final message to anyone who dared resist. But the real surprise? The skull itself still carried enough clues to reconstruct the journey that led it to that wall. To understand why it ended there, we need to understand where this fort stood, and why Rome wanted it gone. Loma, the fort that wouldn't bow. Loma wasn't just another settlement on a hillside. It was a fortified Celtic oppidum positioned in northern Spain's Palencia province, a region where Rome's expansion repeatedly met stubborn resistance. Set atop a naturally defensible ridge, the fort watched over valleys that funneled movement through the Cantabrian foothills. In the late 1st century BC, that vantage point was both a strategic prize and a declaration of independence. The Camarici and neighboring Cantabrian groups had long refused Roman authority, and Augustus, then consolidating power across Iberia, viewed their hill forts as lingering sparks of defiance that needed extinguishing. By 25 BC, Rome had committed fully to the Cantabrian Wars, a decade-long effort to subdue the last unconquered Celts of the peninsula. Archaeology at Loma tells the tale of a methodical siege. Roman camps positioned to choke movement, lines of circumvallation to isolate the defenders, and relentless pressure to wear them down. When modern excavations began in 2020, researchers quickly recognized the telltale signs. Scattered around the fort's northeastern entrance were clusters of Roman arrowheads, hundreds of them, concentrated exactly where a final assault would have driven forward. Their placement wasn't random. It formed a pattern, like a frozen moment from the last desperate hours. The rubble layer inside the fort completed the picture. It wasn't the chaotic collapse from natural decay, but a deliberate demolition. Romans were known for razing captured strongholds to prevent reoccupation, and Loma bore that signature cleanly. Leveled walls, crushed architectural stones, and compacted debris sealing the site before the army withdrew. And inside that demolition layer, lodged right against the interior corner of the wall, lay the skull. Not buried with ceremony, not scattered among a full skeleton, simply trapped by the very stones the Romans had pulled down. That placement is what anchored the timeline. This head was already out in the open when the walls were destroyed. Why only one skull turned up in that specific context remains a question, but its lonely presence made it impossible to ignore. A single head, separated from the body, surviving the assault, the occupation, and the demolition. What could it reveal about that day? More than anyone expected. But to understand its significance, archaeologists had to read the battlefield from the ground up. Evidence of a siege, arrows, fire, and collapse. You don't need a documentary reenactment to visualize a siege at Loma. The soil already plays back the sequence. Every arrowhead tells part of the story. Archaeologists mapped dense clusters outside the northeastern gate, showing where Roman archers concentrated fire to suppress defenders before the breach. The distribution fans outward like ripples, indicating volleys launched from different angles as troops maneuvered up the slope. It's the ancient equivalent of tracking bullet casings in a modern forensic investigation. Just behind those projectiles, deeper in the layers, lay evidence of close quarters fighting. Battered blade fragments, snapped spear tips, and the iron nails from soldiers' caligae, scattered in patterns suggesting movement rather than deposition from decay. Add to that patches of ash, silent testimony to fires either started by defenders in desperation or by Romans clearing structures as they advanced. Each layer reinforces the other until the whole sequence emerges. Bombardment, breach, hand-to-hand struggle, and final storming of the fort. The collapse layer that entombed the skull formed after all this violence. Think of the archaeological stratigraphy like a stack of postcards, each one slightly different, each one capturing a moment. The wall demolition sits above the siege debris, meaning it happened late in the occupation. The skull rested at the transition between these layers, showing it had been exposed before the Romans brought the wall down. This wasn't a body crushed during the fighting, it was already alone, and archaeologists could tell that the rubble wasn't random. Stones angled inward in a pattern consistent with deliberate dismantling, not accidental collapse. Romans often razed resisting forts systematically, stone by stone, to prevent rebels from returning. When they did so at Loma, anything sitting on or near the walls, objects, debris, and in this case a human head, fell with them. Yet the absence of any other skeletal remains nearby raised immediate questions. A battlefield usually scatters bodies, bones, or at least fragments of more than one individual. But here there was just one cranium, trapped where it should not have been. No spine, no ribs, no limbs. Nothing to suggest burial or chance distribution. The bones had a different story to tell, one that began after death. And the surface of the skull held those clues. The bleaching, the flaking, the fractures. All of it pointed to an exposure that wasn't accidental. But to read that story, researchers had to look closer at the head itself. The bones that held massive secrets. Bones hold two timelines, the life of the person and the treatment of the body afterward. The fragments from Loma captured both. Only part of the cranium survived, the upper vault pieces, the maxillae, and a left zygomatic bone. The mandible was missing entirely, as was the rest of the skeleton. In bioarchaeology, such selective presence usually signals separation rather than decay. Bodies tend to decompose in place. Parts generally stay together unless something or someone moves them. The skull's surface added even more context. The bone showed pale, almost chalk-like coloration, the kind that only develops after months of exposure to sun and wind. Flaking on the outer surface suggested cycles of wetting and drying, while dry bone fractures, those sharp-edged breaks that occur after tissue is gone, confirmed that the skull had already begun skeletonizing before being crushed by the falling wall. These details form a taphonomic clock. Much like a weathered fence post tells you how long it's been outside by the fading of the wood, the skull's wear pattern showed it had remained above ground long before burial by rubble. Crucially, there were no perimortem cut marks to reveal the exact method of display. If the head had been impaled on a pike, for instance, Archaeologists might expect distinctive punctures or scraping around the base of the skull. If it had been tied by hair or flesh, soft tissue remnants or particular fracture lines might hint at that. But none of those markers appeared. Instead, the evidence pointed to exposure without specifying the mechanism, meaning the head had been displayed, but the how remains open. Age and sex estimations place the individual at roughly 45 years old, a mature adult male. In the context of a besieged hill fort, this fits the profile of a defender rather than a non-combatant. Combined with the absence of grave goods or burial structure, everything pointed toward a death in conflict, followed by deliberate post-mortem treatment. This left one major unanswered question. Who was he? A local fighter? A Roman ally? A captured outsider? The skull's position and wear told its afterlife, but not its identity. To answer that, researchers turned to the one tool capable of speaking across 2,000 years: DNA. What the genetic evidence revealed wouldn't just identify the man, it would expose precisely what message the Romans intended to leave behind. DNA speaks. A DNA, Methods and Revelations. 2,000 years of dust can't hide a person's DNA. And in the lab, those microscopic fragments finally spoke. They left a trail of clues, tiny stretches of genetic code that researchers pieced together like fingerprints pulled from a long cold case. And as those fragments stitched into patterns on the screen, the story that had been buried in Loma's rubble began to crystallize. The process itself is careful, almost ritualistic. Scientists take the densest part of the skull, often the petrous bone near the ear, because it protects DNA like a safe. They drill out milligram-sized samples, clean the surface to eliminate any modern contamination, and work in labs more controlled than hospital theaters. Every step is monitored, every tool sterilized, because ancient DNA is fragile, and a single stray human skin cell could drown out the signal they're trying to recover. From that powder, they extract fragments, not full genomes, not anything Hollywood would dramatize, but enough. Enough to compare against known ancient reference groups, enough to place the man from Loma on the genetic map of Iron Age Iberia. Think of it like reconstructing a song from only the bass line and part of the chorus. Not perfect, but unmistakable if you know the tune. And the tune was local. The genetic affinities pointed strongly toward Cantabrian Vaxian populations, the communities rooted in those same hills the Romans were determined to break. That meant this wasn't a mercenary, not a foreign auxiliary, not an unfortunate outsider caught in the wrong battle. This man belonged to the people of Loma. He was a defender, someone who stood on those ramparts when Rome tightened the noose. And suddenly, the display made sense. If Rome left his head exposed, they weren't just making a point about conquest. They were sending a message that the land's own sons could not stand against the empire. A message sharp enough to echo across nearby hill forts, across survivors who might have fled, across communities weighing whether resistance was worth the price. But DNA only answers the who, the why, or the calculated logic behind displaying someone's severed head on a ruined wall, demands a deeper look into Roman punitive theater. If Rome meant to send a message, what exactly were they saying? Roman punitive theater, heads, hands, and messages. Rome didn't only conquer with legions, it conquered with symbols, brutal, unmistakable souvenirs that needed no translation. Severed Celtic skulls were collected as war trophies, but more than that, it was a message carved into the skyline, a warning that even the strongest defenders could be reduced to cautionary tales. And Rome understood perfectly how such theater worked. This practice wasn't improvised at Loma. Roman armies had a long repertoire of punitive displays, heads nailed to gates, hands arranged before commanders, entire bodies elevated as public statements. Classical writers mention them almost casually, which tells you how woven these acts were into the empire's military grammar. It wasn't wanton cruelty, it was policy, strategic, consistent, and psychologically calculated. When Roman soldiers placed a head somewhere visible, they weren't speaking to the dead, they were speaking to the living. The message was simple. Resistance ends like this, and Rome does not forget who stood against it. Communities were expected to absorb the sight, internalize it, and spread the story faster than any written proclamation could travel. What makes La Loma especially striking is how targeted the display appears. A local defender's head left for all to see would have cut deeper than any foreign trophy. It was the kind of statement that unsettles morale, shakes local confidence, and reminds neighboring groups that their identity won't protect them. Rome wasn't just defeating warriors, it was dismantling the very idea that opposition was viable. And this is where the cultural contrast sharpens. Head-taking existed in various forms among Celtic groups, but those rituals tied trophies to honor, lineage, or personal valor. Rome stripped that meaning away. They weaponized the act, reframed it, and turned it into an instrument of fear rather than prestige. At La Loma, the skull wasn't a celebration. It was an announcement backed by imperial force. But for all its symbolic weight, one question hangs over the site. What did the people of Cantabria make of this message? How did a fiercely independent culture, known for refusing early Romanization, interpret a warning crafted specifically for them? To answer that, the story has to zoom out beyond one wall and one skull, to the wider storm of conflict rolling across Iberia when La Loma fell. The Cantabrian Wars, the last free Celts of Iberia. Augustus didn't want trouble on the northern frontier. He wanted stability, clean borders, controlled movement, predictable taxation. But the Cantabri and their neighboring groups had other ideas. They occupied rugged mountains and forested ridges, lived in fortified hilltop oppida, and fought with a kind of stubborn independence that Rome found genuinely challenging. And so the Cantabrian Wars erupted, nearly a decade of resistance, ambushes, and relentless Roman countermeasures. La Loma fell in 25 BC, right in the middle of this campaign. It wasn't the biggest fortress nor the most politically central, but strategically it sat in a network of hill forts that communicated through sightlines and shared defense. These were communities that understood their terrain intimately. They used ravines, forests, and elevation as natural allies, striking Roman supply lines and slipping away before legions could pin them down. Rome adapted quickly. Where guerrilla warfare stalled conventional marching columns, Roman engineers built solutions. Siege ramps, circumvallation lines, fortified camps, and systematic destruction of strongholds to prevent reoccupation. This wasn't a war of quick victories. It was a war of patience and overwhelming logistics. And the closer you look, the more La Loma fits into that broader pattern. Its demolition layer lines up with other sites the Romans intentionally raised. The concentration of Roman projectiles reflects the kind of sustained pressure they applied to break resistance. And the skull, positioned before the collapse, matches a moment when Rome wasn't just seizing land but shaping memory. For Augustus, these mountains were the last zone of major unconquered Celtic identity in Iberia. Crushing resistance wasn't enough. The aftermath had to be felt, understood, and remembered. Destroying hill forts and leaving symbolic markers was a way of rewriting the landscape itself, ensuring that even after the army marched on, the ruins continued speaking for Rome. But knowing the politics only gets you so far. The real insight comes when archaeology pulls the evidence back into one place and starts connecting threads. And at La Loma, those threads converge with remarkable clarity. So let's step into that detective space, where every artifact, every fracture, every soil layer becomes a clue in reconstructing what really happened on that ridge. Archaeological detective work, connecting the dots. Archaeology rarely hands out perfect answers. It deals in clues, fragments that either align into a coherent picture or fall apart under scrutiny. At La Loma, the clues didn't scatter, they stacked. And that stacking is what gives the interpretation its weight. Start with the context. The skull was embedded in the collapse layer of the wall, but the bone showed bleaching and weathering that only happens when a head sits exposed for months. That means it didn't end up there during the battle. It was already displayed before the wall came down. Stratigraphy backs this up. The rubble fell on top of the fragments, sealing them in place like a bookmark, marking the moment of destruction. Then add the taphonomy. Dry bone flaking, light coloration, and the absence of the rest of the skeleton rule out a buried corpse, or a body left to decompose where it fell. Someone separated the head from the body, placed it in view, and left it long enough for nature to do its slow work. Not enough to give away the mounting method, no definitive cut marks or post holes, but enough to show deliberate exposure. Layer in the battle evidence, the arrow concentrations, the crushed fortifications, the timing of the demolition. The site didn't collapse accidentally. It was taken, cleared, and likely destroyed as part of a wider Roman push to eliminate strongholds. A head on display fits perfectly within that sequence, like a final punctuation mark on the defeat. Then comes the DNA, the piece that closes the interpretive loop. A local man, a combatant, someone deeply tied to the community Rome wanted to break. When all the clues are read together, collapse layer, exposure, missing body, siege evidence, genetic origin, they point toward the same conclusion, a punitive display crafted to send a message. Could it have been an isolated battlefield accident? Possibly, but it would require several improbable coincidences aligning perfectly. More importantly, the context doesn't behave like an accident, it behaves like a statement. And the discovery of additional skull fragments near other entrance points only deepens that picture. It suggests Loma may not have been a one-off moment, but part of a structured Roman strategy across the region. Which leads to the next question, one that stretches beyond archaeology and into cultural meaning. How did the Cantabri interpret messages carved in bone? And what did such displays reveal about the clash between empire and local identity? Cultural clash. What it meant for both sides. A severed head can be a relic, a trophy, or propaganda, and its meaning shifts depending on the hands that place it on a wall. At Loma, that shift sits right at the heart of the story, because the Celts and the Romans didn't read these displays the same way. They lived inside different symbolic systems, and a single skull could speak two languages at once. Among some Celtic communities, the head carried a weight that wasn't merely anatomical. Classical writers hint at practices where warriors took the heads of enemies as proof of valor or personal strength. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't always ritualized, but the theme appears often enough in art and early texts to suggest that a head could be tied to honor, memory, or even spiritual potency. In those contexts, the meaning was internal, a statement within the community about courage or lineage. Rome stripped that context away. To them, the same object became a tool of statecraft. A severed head was less a trophy and more a message board. It communicated order, deterrence, and the consequences of defiance. And unlike Celtic practices, which tended to revolve around interpersonal honor, Roman displays operated publicly and legally. They were intended for crowds, for neighboring settlements, for the landscape itself. Rome performed its power where everyone could see it. That difference matters. When Loma fell and a local defender's head was placed in open view, the people who fled or survived weren't seeing a warrior's relic. They were seeing Rome rewrite a local tradition into an imperial threat. The message was no longer about personal bravery. It was about submission, humiliation, and the reshaping of political identity. Think of the way modern states use visible sanctions, public notices, confiscations, or structural demolitions, not just to punish, but to warn others. The logic is similar. The act is aimed at the wider audience, not the individual. And this contrast frames the skull's power. Two cultures could look at the same bone and read completely different stories, but only one of those cultures controlled the battlefield at Loma. Yet for all this interpretive weight, archaeology has limits. Displays leave clues, not confessions. So what can't we say? What still sits in the gaps, and where new evidence may sharpen, or challenge, the picture. Open questions, scientific limits, and the final echo. Good stories in archaeology come with footnotes. Loma is no exception. Even though the evidence lines up cleanly, the gaps matter, and acknowledging them gives the narrative its honesty. Start with the physical limits. The skull holds no definitive mounting marks. There's no surviving mandible, no neck vertebrae, no postcranial bones to confirm how the body was handled. The fractures show weathering rather than explicit cutting, which helps frame exposure, but not the exact method of display. Then there's the DNA, valuable, but not a full genome. It tells us regional ancestry with confidence, but it can't pinpoint the man's village, his family, or the details of his life. And of course, the sample size is one, a powerful case study, but still just one. But archaeology rarely stays still. Additional skull fragments found near the entrance area suggest the possibility of more than one displayed head, or at the very least, more complex activity around the gate. Future analysis, isotopes for diet and mobility, micro-CT scans to refine taphonomic detail, expanded ancient DNA sampling, could reveal patterns that deepen or adjust the interpretation. Every new dig at Loma adds another thread to the puzzle about this Celtic skull as a possible war trophy, and the story is still growing. Even so, the strongest reading holds steady. The bone, the exposure, the collapse, and the DNA converge on a consistent picture. A local defender was decapitated and placed where everyone could see him. And when the wall finally fell, the rubble froze that moment in time. Knowing how visible violence shaped obedience and fear, how does that change the way we think about the mechanics of power? Ancient or modern? Does removing the drama make the lesson clearer or harder to face? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.